year was 1814. Across the cold and tired lands of Europe, people slowly emerged from years of smoke, marching armies, and endless war. Horses no longer thundered through every village road. Cannons had grown quieter. The air itself seemed exhausted. For more than 20 years, Europe had lived beneath the shadow of revolution and conquest. Kingdoms had risen and fallen. Borders had changed again and again. Millions of ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, bakers, soldiers, servants, had watched rulers argue while history rolled over them like a slow and unstoppable storm. And now, at last, the storm had weakened. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once controlled much of Europe, had been defeated. Not destroyed entirely, not yet, but removed from power and sent away to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time in decades, the rulers of Europe could finally sit down and talk. Very slowly, very carefully, very endlessly. This great meeting would become known as the Congress of Vienna. At first glance, it sounded deeply boring. A giant diplomatic conference, thousands of papers, endless conversations about borders, arguments over provinces and rivers and kingdoms most people had never heard of. But beneath the quiet conversations and glittering ballrooms, Europe's future was being rebuilt piece by piece. And so tonight, as candles burn softly in the distance and winter winds drift across old European streets, we begin our long and sleepy journey into the Congress of Vienna. A story of kings, of tired diplomats, of velvet curtains and echoing palace halls. A story of kings, of tired diplomats, of velvet curtains and echoing palace halls, of maps spread across polished wooden tables, and of men who believed they could organize all of Europe like pieces on a giant chessboard. The city of Vienna had been chosen as the meeting place. Vienna was elegant, wealthy, and proud. Wide streets curved between grand buildings. Horse-drawn carriages rolled slowly over cobblestones. At night, chandeliers glowed behind palace windows, while musicians played soft dances for nobles wearing silk and medals. The city belonged to the Austrian Empire, ruled by Emperor Francis I. But the true architect of the Congress was not the emperor himself. It was a quiet and intelligent Austrian diplomat named Klemens von Metternich. Metternich was calm, elegant, and deeply cautious. He disliked revolution. He disliked chaos. Most of all, he disliked sudden change. To him, Europe should be stable, ordered, predictable. Kings should remain kings. To him, Europe should be stable. To him, Europe should be stable, ordered, predictable. Kings should remain kings. Borders should remain fixed. And ordinary people should not become too excited about ideas like revolution or democracy. These beliefs would shape nearly every conversation at the Congress. Metternich welcomed diplomats into Vienna with magnificent celebrations. There were concerts, dinners, hunting parties, operas, dances, and endless formal visits. Some people joked,
Representatives arrived from nearly every important nation. From United Kingdom came the experienced Foreign Minister, Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh. Castlereagh was serious and practical. Britain's main goal was balance. The British government wanted no single country to become too powerful again. Especially not France. Especially not another Napoleon. From Russia came Tsar Alexander I of Russia himself. Alexander was intelligent, emotional, and difficult to predict. Sometimes he spoke like a conqueror, sometimes like a philosopher, sometimes almost like a dreamer. He believed he had helped save Europe from Napoleon, and he expected rewards, very large rewards. From Prussia came hard-working officials who wished to expand their territory and strengthen their military position. Prussia had suffered greatly during the Napoleonic Wars. Now it wanted compensation. And then there was France itself. Though defeated, France was still represented at the Congress by one of the most skilled diplomats in Europe, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. Talleyrand was remarkable. He had served the French monarchy, then the Revolution, then Napoleon, and now the restored monarchy again. He survived every political disaster with astonishing calmness. Some called him dishonest. Others called him brilliant. Most probably agreed he was both. Talleyrand understood something very important. France had lost the war. But diplomacy was another battlefield entirely. And on this battlefield, France might still regain influence. And on this battlefield, France might still regain influence. The first great question facing the Congress was simple to ask and extremely difficult to answer. How could Europe prevent another Napoleon? No one wanted another generation of constant warfare. No one wanted revolutionary armies marching endlessly across the continent. The leaders believed stability depended on balance. If one country became too strong, the others would unite against it. Therefore, power needed to be carefully distributed, balanced like weights on a scale. This idea became known as the balance of power. It sounds calm and reasonable, but achieving it required endless negotiations. Who should control Poland? Who should rule parts of Germany? What would happen to Italy? How much land should Prussia receive? How powerful should France remain? And each answer created new arguments. One of the biggest disputes involved Poland and Saxony. Tsar Alexander wanted most of Poland under Russian influence. Meanwhile, Prussia wanted the Kingdom of Saxony as compensation for its suffering during the wars. But Austria and Britain worried this would make Russia and Prussia far too powerful. So conversations stretched late into the night. Maps were unfolded. Borders were redrawn, then erased, then redrawn again. Diplomats walked slowly through palace corridors, carrying papers tied with ribbons. Servants refilled candles while tired officials debated rivers, fortresses, and provinces. Outside, snow sometimes drifted quietly across Vienna's streets. Inside, Europe was being rearranged. Yet despite the seriousness of these discussions, the Congress often resembled an enormous social festival. Nobles hosted extravagant parties nearly every evening. There were fireworks, concerts, masked balls, luxurious dinners with countless courses. Some visitors became exhausted simply trying to attend every event. The Austrian court wanted Vienna to appear graceful, civilized, and magnificent. And so the city glowed with music and celebration. But beneath all the beauty lay nervousness. The rulers feared revolution deeply. The memory of the French Revolution still haunted Europe. They remembered angry crowds, fallen kings, executions, chaos.
To men like Metternich, revolution was like a dangerous fire that could spread across borders. And so the Congress was not merely about territory. It was about controlling the future, keeping order, preserving monarchy, and preventing ordinary people from demanding too much political power. As winter settled over Vienna, the negotiations continued, slowly, patiently, sometimes painfully slowly. Diplomacy in the 19th century was not fast. There were no telephones, no airplanes, no instant communication. Letters traveled by horse and carriage. Meetings lasted hours, sometimes days, and often the same argument returned again and again. Yet beneath the slow pace, something important was happening. For perhaps the first time, Europe's great powers were attempting to cooperate together after a massive war, not simply to defeat an enemy, but to create a lasting peace. Whether they would succeed remained uncertain, but for now, the candles still burned in Vienna's palaces. The music still echoed through ballroom halls, and diplomats still leaned over maps late into the night, trying to decide the fate of an entire continent. As snow drifted softly outside the palace windows, Europe waited quietly for its future to be written. Future to be written. By the winter of 1814, the city of Vienna had become the center of Europe. Carriages rolled endlessly through icy streets. Servants hurried through palace corridors, carrying silver trays and sealed letters. Musicians performed deep into the night, while noble guests danced beneath enormous chandeliers. And somewhere, in warm candlelit rooms, hidden behind all the music and celebration, diplomats continued the slow work of rebuilding Europe. The Congress of Vienna was not one single meeting. It was thousands of meetings, small conversations in quiet corners, formal discussions around long wooden tables, private agreements whispered during dinner parties. Sometimes the future of entire kingdoms depended upon a short conversation beside a fireplace. And so Europe moved forward, not through battles now, but to endless talking, very polite talking, very careful talking, and sometimes very suspicious talking. Among all the men gathered in Vienna, perhaps none understood diplomacy better than Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. Talleyrand represented defeated France. This should have placed him in a weak position. After all, France had caused years of war across Europe. Napoleon's armies had invaded country after country. Many rulers blamed France for the suffering of an entire generation. Yet Talleyrand remained calm. He moved slowly through Vienna's palaces with quiet confidence. He dressed elegantly, spoke carefully, and listened more than he talked. Talleyrand understood that the victorious powers did not fully trust one another. Russia wanted influence over Poland. Prussia wanted more territory in Germany. United Kingdom feared any nation becoming too strong, and Austrian Empire feared both Russian expansion and revolutionary ideas. The alliance that had defeated Napoleon was already beginning to crack. Talleyrand saw opportunity.
If France could present itself not as a defeated enemy, but as a useful partner in maintaining balance, then France might return to the center of European politics far sooner than anyone expected. It was an extraordinary diplomatic performance. Slowly, carefully, France began regaining influence. Meanwhile, the social life of Vienna grew even larger. The Austrian foreign minister, Klemens von Metternich, believed politics worked best in elegant surroundings, so every week brought more celebrations. Grand balls filled enormous palace halls. Crystal chandeliers shimmered like frozen stars. Candles reflected softly against polished mirrors. Ladies in silk gowns moved gracefully through crowded rooms while orchestras played waltzes late into the night. Vienna became famous for its music, and especially for dancing. In fact, one famous observer joked, "The Congress dances, but it does not move." It was a perfect description, because while nobles danced endlessly, negotiations often progressed painfully slowly. Still, the parties themselves had political importance. Diplomats formed friendships over dinners. Agreements emerged during informal conversations. Trust sometimes grew more easily during music and wine than during official meetings. Politics and entertainment became completely intertwined. The most difficult issue remained Poland and Saxony. This problem haunted the Congress for months. Tsar Alexander I of Russia wanted control over most of Poland. He imagined creating a Polish kingdom connected closely to Russia. At the same time, Prussia hoped to absorb the Kingdom of Saxony, but other nations became alarmed. If Russia gained Poland and Prussia gained Saxony, both countries would grow much stronger. Austria worried about powerful neighbors. Britain worried the balance of Europe would collapse. Even defeated France opposed the plan, and so tensions slowly increased. Diplomats smiled politely in public, while privately preparing for possible conflict. At one point, there were even fears that the allies who had defeated Napoleon might soon go to war against one another. The situation became extremely delicate, very civilized, very elegant, and quietly dangerous. Throughout these months, ordinary life in Vienna continued around the Congress. Bakers woke before dawn to prepare bread. Stable workers cared for tired horses. Street sweepers cleaned snow and mud from narrow roads. Shopkeepers sold gloves, candles, wine, and fabrics to wealthy visitors. Thousands of servants worked constantly inside noble households. The Congress brought enormous activity to the city. Hotels overflowed with guests. Tailors worked endlessly repairing uniforms and sewing dresses. Cooks prepared magnificent meals for state banquets. The upper classes enjoyed luxury and music, while much of Europe beyond Vienna still struggled with poverty after years of war. Yet for a brief moment, Vienna felt almost magical, a city glowing with diplomacy and candlelight. Among the important visitors was Tsar Alexander himself. Unlike many rulers who stayed distant from negotiations, Alexander enjoyed direct involvement. He attended meetings personally. He spoke passionately about morality, religion, and peace. Sometimes he appeared deeply sincere. Other times, experienced diplomats suspected ambition hidden beneath idealistic language. Alexander believed he had saved Europe from Napoleon. Russian armies had marched farther west than any others. Russian soldiers had suffered enormously during the wars. Now Alexander wanted recognition and territory, particularly Poland. Metternich often found Alexander exhausting. The Austrian diplomat preferred careful calculation and stability. Alexander, meanwhile, could become emotional and unpredictable. Their conversations stretched endlessly. Careful words concealed deep disagreements. Yet both men understood they needed one another. This was the strange rhythm of diplomacy at Vienna. Cooperation mixed with suspicion, friendship mixed with rivalry, politeness hiding fear. The British representative, Robert Stewart Viscount Castlereagh, remained focused on one central goal: preventing future domination of Europe by any single power. Britain did not want France dominating Europe again, but Britain also did not want Russia becoming overwhelmingly powerful. Castlereagh worked tirelessly to maintain balance. He preferred compromise over dramatic action. In many ways, Britain acted as a stabilizing force during the Congress. Though calm and disciplined, Castlereagh often appeared weary. Diplomacy required endless patience, long meetings, constant negotiation, and careful control of emotions. One careless statement could damage months of work. As weeks became months, diplomats slowly developed solutions. Some borders would change, some kingdoms would return, some territories would be exchanged like pieces in a giant puzzle. The Netherlands would be strengthened north of France to help contain future French aggression. German states would be reorganized into a loose German confederation. Italy would remain divided into several states, many influenced by Austria. Switzerland would remain neutral. Again and again, the leaders returned to the same principle: balance. No country should grow too powerful, no revolution should spread too far, and Europe should remain stable. At least, that was the hope. But history rarely stays quiet forever. Even while the Congress worked to restore old monarchies and traditional order, new ideas continued spreading across Europe. Nationalism, liberalism, demands for constitutions, demands for political participation. Young students, writers, and thinkers dreamed of united nations and greater freedoms. Men like Metternich viewed these ideas as dangerous storms gathering in the distance. For now, however, the rulers believed they had time. They believed careful diplomacy could preserve peace, and so Vienna continued its endless rhythm of music and negotiation. Violins echoed through palace halls. Candles flickered softly beside maps of Europe. Snow melted slowly outside the windows, and late into the night, diplomats continued arguing politely about the future of the continent, one border at a time. By the early months of 1815, the long winter in Vienna began to soften. Snow slowly melted along the edges of narrow streets. Carriages no longer struggled through ice, but rolled more quietly over damp cobblestones. The air felt lighter, and yet inside the grand palaces, the atmosphere remained heavy with thought. For months, Europe's leaders had talked. Now they needed to decide. Large wooden tables were covered with maps. Carefully drawn lines marked rivers, mountains, and borders that had shifted again and again during years of war. Ink marks showed kingdoms that no longer existed. Pencil lines suggested new ones that might soon appear. Diplomats leaned over these maps in silence. Sometimes they spoke softly. Sometimes they argued, still politely, still calmly, but with growing firmness. Because now the decisions would become permanent, or at least permanent for a time. One of the most delicate questions concerned France. After years under Napoleon Bonaparte, France had expanded far beyond its traditional borders. Now the Congress needed to decide, how much should France lose, and how much should it keep? Too much punishment might create anger and future revenge. Too little punishment might allow France to rise again too quickly. It was a careful balance. Once again, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord played his role with remarkable skill. He argued that France should be treated not as a defeated enemy, but as an equal partner in restoring order. He spoke about legitimacy, the idea that rightful monarchy should be restored. This principle appealed to many rulers. After all, it supported their own positions as kings and emperors. Slowly, France avoided the harshest punishment. It would lose some territory, but it would remain a major power. And most importantly, it would not be completely isolated. Talleyrand had succeeded. Beyond France, the map of Europe continued to change. The region of Germany, once a confusing collection of many small states, would now be organized into the German Confederation. It was not a single unified country. Instead, it was a loose alliance of states under the influence of Austrian Empire. This arrangement allowed Austria to maintain influence without creating a powerful united Germany that might challenge it. In Italy, a similar approach was taken. The peninsula remained divided into multiple kingdoms and states. Some were ruled directly or indirectly by Austria. Others were restored to traditional rulers. Unity was not encouraged. Division was safer. At least that is what the diplomats believed. In the north, a new kingdom was formed, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It combined the Dutch Republic with territories that are now Belgium. This larger state was designed to act as a barrier against future French expansion, a protective wall, built not from stone, but from political boundaries. Meanwhile, Prussia received important territories in western Germany. This strengthened Prussia, placing it closer to France and giving it a role in maintaining balance. Once again, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord played his role with remarkable skill. He argued that France should be treated not as a defeated enemy, but as an equal partner in restoring order. He spoke about legitimacy, the idea that rightful monarchies should be restored. This principle appealed to many rulers. After all, it supported their own positions as kings and emperors. Slowly, France avoided the harshest punishment. It would lose some territory, but it would remain a major power, and most importantly, it would not be completely isolated. Talleyrand had succeeded. Beyond France, the map of Europe continued to change. The region of Germany, once a confusing collection of many small states, would now be organized into the German Confederation. It was not a single unified country. Instead, it was a loose alliance of states under the influence of the Austrian Empire. This arrangement allowed Austria to maintain influence without creating a powerful united Germany that might challenge it. In Italy, a similar approach was taken. The peninsula remained divided into multiple kingdoms and states. Some were ruled directly or indirectly by Austria. Others were restored to traditional rulers. Unity was not encouraged. Division was safer. At least, that is what the diplomats believed. In the north, a new kingdom was formed, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It combined the Dutch Republic with territories that are now Belgium. This larger state was designed to act as a barrier against future French expansion, a protective wall built not from stone, but from political boundaries. Meanwhile, Prussia received important territories in western Germany. This strengthened Prussia, placing it closer to France and giving it a role in maintaining balance. Russia gained significant influence over Poland, though not complete control, as Tsar Alexander I of Russia had originally hoped. Still, Russia emerged from the Congress as one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Each decision seemed careful, measured, balanced, but each also planted small seeds for future tension. During these months, the pace of life remained slow and deliberate. Diplomacy required patience. Every agreement needed discussion. Every disagreement needed time. Letters traveled slowly between capitals. Instructions from distant governments took days or weeks to arrive. And so, the Congress continued in its steady rhythm. Morning meetings, afternoon discussions, evening dinners, nighttime balls, again and again. Then, in March 1815, something unexpected happened. Something that briefly shook the calm surface of Vienna's careful diplomacy. Napoleon Bonaparte escaped. From the island of Elba, where he had been sent after his defeat, Napoleon returned to France. He landed quietly, but soon soldiers began joining him. Villages welcomed him. His influence spread rapidly. Within weeks, Napoleon had regained power. The news reached Vienna like a distant thunder. At first, disbelief, then concern, then urgency. The man they had been working to contain had returned. The Congress changed immediately. The slow, almost sleepy pace of diplomacy became sharper, more focused. The powers of Europe quickly agreed on one thing: Napoleon must be defeated again. There could be no compromise this time, no negotiation, only action. Armies began to prepare once more. Soldiers marched. Supplies were gathered. Generals planned campaigns. While the diplomats in Vienna had spent months discussing borders, the reality of war suddenly returned, quietly at first, then more clearly. Yet even in this moment of crisis, the Congress did not collapse. In fact, the shared threat of Napoleon helped unite the powers. Disagreements over Poland and Saxony became less urgent. The immediate danger required cooperation. Once again, Europe's leaders found themselves working together, this time not in ballrooms, but in preparation for battle. Far from Vienna, events moved quickly. Napoleon advanced through France. Opposing forces gathered to stop him. The final confrontation would come at the Battle of Waterloo. But in Vienna, the diplomats continued their work. They finalized agreements, signed documents, and prepared the foundations of a new European order. Even as armies marched, the Congress moved toward its conclusion, slowly, deliberately, as it always had. By the time news arrived of Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the shape of Europe had already been largely decided. The war that had interrupted their careful work was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Napoleon would not return again. This time, the peace would hold, at least for a while. In the quiet rooms of Vienna's palaces, documents lay completed. Borders had been drawn, kingdoms restored, alliances formed. The leaders believed they had created stability. They believed they had secured peace. And for many years they would be partly correct. But beyond the maps and agreements, deeper forces were still moving. Ideas, dreams, and the quiet desires of millions of people across Europe. For now, however, the candles burned low. The music softened, and the Congress of Vienna approached its long, careful end, one decision at a time. By the late spring of 1815, the great halls of Vienna had begun to grow quieter. The music still played, though perhaps not as loudly. The candles still burned, though a little shorter each evening. The endless rhythm of meetings, dinners, and dances had slowly started to come to an end. After many months of careful discussion, Europe's leaders were finally finishing their work. They believed they had done something important, something lasting, something that might keep the continent at peace. The agreements of the Congress were not created all at once. They had formed gradually, like layers of soft snow settling over a landscape. Each decision connected to another, each compromise linked to a larger idea. At the center of everything stood one guiding principle: balance. The leaders believed that peace could survive only if no single country became too powerful. Power must be shared, carefully, evenly, like weight balanced across a scale. France, once feared and dominant under Napoleon Bonaparte, was now reduced, but not destroyed. Its borders were returned roughly to what they had been before the Great Wars. It lost territories, but it was not divided, not humiliated completely, not erased from the map. This was intentional. The diplomats understood that a broken France might become dangerous again. Anger, after all, could grow quietly, and then return suddenly. So France was kept strong enough to remain stable, but not strong enough to dominate. A careful balance. Around France, a ring of stronger states was created. To the north, the Kingdom of the Netherlands stood as a barrier. To the east, Prussia was strengthened with new lands. To the south, in Italy, Austrian influence ensured control over key regions. It was like building invisible walls, not made of stone, but of alliances and borders, designed to prevent another wave of expansion. The reorganization of Germany was another important piece. The German Confederation brought together dozens of states under a loose system. It was not unity, not yet. Instead, it was controlled cooperation. Austria held a leading role. This allowed stability without creating a powerful, unified Germany that might upset the balance. For the moment it worked, but beneath the surface, ideas of unity were already quietly growing. In Italy, division remained the chosen solution. Different regions were ruled by different leaders, some directly connected to the Austrian Empire, others restored to traditional monarchs. There was no single Italian nation, no unified identity recognized by the Congress. Again, this was intentional. A divided Italy was easier to manage, easier to control, and less likely to challenge the balance of Europe. One of the more peaceful outcomes involved Switzerland. The Congress officially recognized Swiss neutrality. This meant Switzerland would remain outside future wars, a quiet country, neutral ground, a place apart from the shifting power struggles of Europe. It was a rare moment of simplicity in an otherwise complex system. But beyond borders and territories, the Congress also created something less visible, a system of cooperation, a habit of meeting, a belief that problems between nations could be discussed before turning into war. This idea became known as the Concert of Europe. It was not a formal organization. There were no permanent offices, no written constitution, but there was an understanding. The great powers, Austria, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and eventually France, would communicate. They would try to resolve conflicts together, quietly, carefully, before violence began. For a time, this system worked surprisingly well. Among the leaders, Klemens von Metternich remained one of the strongest defenders of this new order. He believed stability depended on tradition, on monarchy, on control. He feared revolution deeply. The memory of the French Revolution still lingered in his mind like a distant storm. To Metternich, change was dangerous. Too much freedom could lead to chaos. Too much nationalism could break empires apart. So he supported strict control, censorship, careful monitoring of political ideas. Across Europe, rulers began to watch their populations more closely. Universities were observed, newspapers were controlled, political movements were restricted. It was a quiet effort to preserve order. Yet beyond the control of kings and diplomats, new ideas continued to move, slowly, quietly, like water beneath frozen ground. People began to think differently about identity, about belonging, about nations. In Germany, some dreamed of unity. In Italy, others imagined a single country. Across Europe, small groups of thinkers discussed liberty, representation, and rights. These ideas were not yet powerful enough to change the system created in Vienna, but they had not disappeared. They were waiting. Meanwhile, life in Vienna began to return to normal. Many of the diplomats prepared to leave. Carriages were packed. Servants folded clothing. Documents were carefully sealed and sent to distant capitals. The great celebrations became less frequent. The music softened. The city slowly released its role as the center of Europe. For a brief time, Vienna had held the attention of an entire continent. Now, that moment was ending. The final agreements of the Congress were signed in June 1815. They represented months of effort, thousands of conversations, endless patience. The leaders believed they had achieved something rare, a general peace after a long and destructive period of war, and in many ways they had. Europe would avoid a large continent-wide war for nearly 40 years, a remarkable achievement for that time. But peace built by careful balance is never perfectly still. It requires constant attention, constant adjustment, and even the most carefully drawn borders cannot fully contain human ideas. For now, however, the system held. The candles in Vienna burned low. The music faded into memory, and the Congress of Vienna came quietly to its end, leaving behind a Europe that felt at last calm, at least on the surface. And so, as the final documents were sealed and the last carriages rolled away from Vienna, the great gathering slowly faded into memory. The music stopped. The chandeliers dimmed. The long conversations ended. What remained was something less visible, but far more important. A new shape for Europe. For the first time in many years, the continent became quiet. Not perfectly silent, but quieter than before. Armies returned home. Fields once used for marching soldiers were planted again with crops. Villages rebuilt slowly. Roads that had carried war now carried trade. And across Europe, ordinary people began to live again without the constant fear of invasion. This was the peace created in part by the Congress, A peace built not on emotion, but on calculation, not on trust, but on balance. The system that emerged, often called the Concert of Europe, continued to guide relations between the great powers. Countries like United Kingdom, Russia, Prussia, and the Austrian Empire maintained communication. They met occasionally. They discussed problems. They attempted to avoid war through cooperation. It was not perfect. There were disagreements. There were tensions. But compared to the decades before, Europe experienced a remarkable period of relative stability. Large-scale war between the great powers became rare. France, once the center of conflict under Napoleon Bonaparte, slowly returned to the European system. It was no longer isolated, no longer treated as a permanent enemy. Instead, it became part of the balance. This decision proved important. Rather than creating lasting bitterness, it allowed France to settle into the new order, and for a time, it worked. Yet, beneath this calm surface, change continued quietly. The Congress had restored kings and emperors. It had strengthened traditional power. It had tried to stop the spread of revolutionary ideas. But ideas are difficult to control. They do not respect borders. They do not move according to treaties. They travel slowly, from person to person, from book to book, from whisper to whisper. Across Europe, people began thinking about identity in new ways, not just loyalty to a king, but loyalty to a nation. In the lands of the German Confederation, some dreamed of unity. They imagined a single Germany. In the divided regions of Italy, others dreamed of becoming one country. These dreams were quiet at first, discussed in small groups, shared carefully, but they did not disappear. At the same time, new political ideas continued to grow, ideas about freedom, about rights, about representation. The memory of the French Revolution had not vanished. It had only been pushed aside. Leaders like Klemens von Metternich worked hard to suppress these ideas. Governments increased censorship. Universities were watched. Public discussions were limited, but control was never complete. Thoughts continued to move quietly through society, like wind passing through closed windows. Over time, small disturbances began to appear. Not great wars, but smaller uprisings, protests, revolutions that rose briefly and were often suppressed. In some places, people demanded constitutions. In others, they demanded national independence. Each event was like a gentle knock against the system built in Vienna. Not strong enough to break it immediately, but enough to remind everyone that the world was still changing. And yet, even with these challenges, the achievements of the Congress remained significant. For decades, Europe avoided the kind of massive, continent-wide wars that had defined the early 19th century. The idea of balance continued to influence diplomacy. The habit of cooperation remained. Even as new nations eventually formed, Germany and Italy among them, the memory of Vienna's careful diplomacy still shaped how leaders approached international relations. If we look back now, the Congress of Vienna appears almost quiet, almost slow. A long series of conversations, endless discussions over maps, dinners, dances, and polite arguments. It does not feel dramatic in the way that battles do. There are no sudden explosions, no rapid movements, only careful thought, patience, and time. But sometimes history moves most powerfully in silence, not through war, but through decisions made in quiet rooms, through agreements written slowly by candlelight, through people who believe they can shape the future not with weapons, but with words. And so the story of the Congress of Vienna comes to its gentle end, a story of balance, of caution, of rulers trying, in their own way, to create lasting peace. Outside the palaces of Vienna, the world continued to change. New ideas grew, new generations rose, and history moved forward, as it always does, slowly, quietly, and without ever truly stopping. Long after the final signatures had dried, long after the last carriage had left Vienna, The Congress did not truly end. It simply became quieter. In the years that followed, Europe moved carefully, almost cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace it had just created. Kings ruled again, borders held steady, armies rested more often than they marched. And across the continent, a strange feeling settled in. Not joy, not excitement, but something softer, relief. The system created in Vienna continued to operate in the background, like a slow and steady machine. Diplomats wrote letters, leaders held meetings, problems were discussed rather than fought. And though disagreements still existed, as they always do, they no longer immediately led to war. It was not a perfect peace, but it was a working peace. In quiet government rooms across Europe, men influenced by the ideas of Klemens von Metternich continued their careful work. They believed stability must be protected at any cost. Newspapers were watched, public speeches were limited, writers sometimes spoke in careful coded language. Universities were observed, students were monitored, all to prevent sudden change, all to keep Europe calm. But calmness, like still water, often hides movement beneath the surface. In small towns and growing cities, people continued to think, to question, to imagine. A student might sit quietly in a candlelit room, reading about liberty. A young poet might write about a united homeland. A group of friends might speak in whispers about reform. These were not loud actions, not yet, but they were persistent. In the lands of the German Confederation, the idea of unity slowly gained strength. At first, it was just a thought, a distant possibility. Then, a discussion. Then, a quiet hope. In Italy, similar ideas appeared. The peninsula, divided into many states, began to feel, slowly, that it could be something more, something whole, something united. The Congress had created order, but it had also delayed dreams, and delayed dreams often return stronger. Meanwhile, United Kingdom remained somewhat apart from continental politics, watching carefully, maintaining balance from a distance. Russia continued to grow in influence, vast and powerful. Prussia strengthened quietly, becoming more organized, more disciplined. And the Austrian Empire held together many different peoples under one rule, stable on the surface, but complex beneath. Each power watched the others. Each waited. Each adjusted, like pieces on a board that had been carefully arranged, but not fixed forever. Years passed, slowly, quietly, without great continental war. This alone made the Congress remarkable, because before Vienna, Europe had been filled with almost constant conflict. After Vienna, there was time for rebuilding, time for growth, time for thinking, and yet time also allows change. New generations grew up who had not experienced the Napoleonic Wars directly. To them, the system created in Vienna felt less like a spasania and more like a limitation. They did not remember the chaos, they only saw the restrictions. And so their thoughts were different, their expectations were different, their patience was less. By the time the revolutions of 1848 began to spread across Europe, the quiet system built at the Congress started to show its age. It had been designed to stop sudden change, but now change had been building slowly for decades, and when it finally appeared, it came not as a single event, but as many, across cities, across borders, across societies. Still, even as the old system weakened, its influence remained. The idea that nations should meet, that diplomacy should come before war, that balance matters. These ideas did not disappear. They continued, quietly, just as the Congress itself had once worked quietly behind the scenes. And so, as we come to the final moments of this long, slow journey, the story does not end with a dramatic conclusion. There is no final battle, no sudden turning point, only a gentle understanding that history is not made only in moments of noise, but also in moments of silence. The Congress of Vienna was one of those quiet moments.